I spent much longer than I'd like to admit wondering how to open this video, a balance of a tension-catching hook while respecting the topic and achieving a tone that fits it just the same. But I'm nowhere close to mastering that level of blending comedy and poignance that Satoshi Kon exhibited in today's topic, Tokyo Godfathers, and so I figured letting his work speak for itself was the best option. That scene of these three unhoused individuals, Hana, Gin, and Miyuki, finding a child that they name Kiyoko in the garbage occurs in its first few minutes, and then the remainder of the film is a wild and vibrant journey full of all kinds of people as they try to find her mother and understand the situation in full. Is she someone who can, or should, care for this child? Is there anything she could say or do that proves, against what she's shown so far, that, as Gin says, they ask because of the quandary which comes from them being the ones to find it. Hana, a trans woman living in a shared space on the streets with the other two, finds a great deal of validation in this occurrence, even saying that since they found her on Christmas, Kiyoko was a gift from God, the one who she says made a mistake with her gender. However, as Gin and Miyuki point out, how could they properly care for a child when they can hardly provide for themselves? Living off of scavenged materials and small purchases, worrying a lot over just one day's train fare, another mouth to feed is even less possible than we usually think of. But on the other hand, this is a discarded child. Are they simply going to turn it over to the authorities where it might just be shuttled around from home to home for its entire childhood? Hana herself was abandoned as a child, and so she speaks from experience when she stops on the way of turning Kiyoko over to the authorities and says, there are many possibilities in this situation, but two opposites stand out. To be stable but without love, or to be loved without stability. Faced with this decision, a trade-off indicative of everything which has pushed us so far forward as a species only to hold us back as individuals, which is the proper choice? Where does selfishness meet love? Hana, however, comes up with the third option, where they track down the mother and properly understand the situation instead, splitting both down the middle. They don't have the sting of selfishness from either end, keeping the child to fulfill their own wishes, nor discarding it to someone else to carelessly avoid responsibility. But going on the quest, they might be able to provide a better option than the uncertainty that lies in a snap decision. Of course, on this wild adventure that ensues, the twists and turns, and within these three characters, we see this idea of the balance of care of sorts deepen even more. Now, before we spend an entire video speaking about one single term, let's do something I need to work on overall and define that term first. So, care. Excuse the trope, but two definitions for its noun form exist, and they are the provision of what is necessary for the health, welfare, maintenance, and protection of something or someone, and serious attention or consideration applied to doing something correctly or to avoid damage or risk. We're talking about with respect to others mostly here today, so the first definition is the more pertinent to us, but I think the expression of serious attention or consideration from the latter definition is pretty important as well. I really like how that's phrased. But we could kind of generally summarize it as giving of oneself for something or someone else, since the provision of those necessities or necessary things would come from one's own necessary things. This fits even if it's simply, say, spending time with someone else, because time is something limited that you need, and then give up for that person or that thing. It's an interesting question. How much is too much? Because we understand that the world only functions through mutual care. We can only have transit systems and communal spaces and consistent shops insofar as we care for others enough to give of ourselves for those things, at its most basic, just in something like taxes. but we're also aware that the world falls apart if no one cares for themselves. The whole point of having societal anything is defeated if no one is at least somewhat selfish enough to take those advantages. What we'll see in Tokyo Godfathers between these three main characters, Hana, Gin, and Miyuki, are different ranges of care and selfishness and the effect they have, hopefully providing an idea of what we should and shouldn't do in part in our own lives. It'll be a very classic prof character analysis video like a couple years ago, but I hope that's something everyone new will still enjoy. And at the very least, at the time of recording, Tokyo Godfathers is free on this very site, so you can watch it before this at no cost but time. And, of course, I heavily recommend that first. Hana is probably the most classic case, of course with her own twists, but as such the best to start on. She's the only one of the three to start her life in this awful situation, abandoned as a child before she could even understand what her parents' faces looked like. This opened her life on a feeling of rejection, of course, which is important to keep in mind and only furthered by having a non-conventional identity. This means that as she grew up and discovered her own identity, one which is harshly rejected by many still to this day, and even more so in the early 2000s when this movie was made, it would become even harder for her to receive the kind of support she would need to properly get on her feet and start a usual life. With both of these starting from behind factors, it's almost impossible for her to have ever succeeded in what we typically call success in life. It's a matter of equity. With so many disadvantages, she needed some kind of support. There's no way she could just work harder and get out of her disadvantage. There is one place which offered support though, Angel Tower, a bar run by a drag queen we only hear referred to as Mother, which was of course welcoming to those with non-traditional lives. Here she seems to have found a real home as she returns during the film, and we see, well, calling it a welcome with open arms would actually be a conservative description. It's more like a welcome with a full body grip. On the journey to find Kiyoko's mother, she and Miyuki had lost track of Gin, who seems to be in charge of their living situation, and so they had no option but to come here to her past home, as they couldn't stay out in the cold with a newborn as they might have if it were just them. That means that coming here was her last resort for the sake of somebody else. Luckily inside they find Gin again, unluckily in very terrible shape, but we'll get to that later. But resting for a moment inside, we get a real confirmation of just how much of a home this was to Hana, as she easily settles in as her and Mother reminisce. But what she thinks back to is the reason she left. Performing a show, she tossed a glass of wine carelessly, which landed on a customer, which made him angry, which made him insult her, which made her assault him. This is what leads Hana to say that she knows she has no right to come back here when she arrived, seeing it as a terrible thing she did to a place which needs to maintain a reputation to exist and support people like her. She left permanently due to this, living with a man she loved named Ken instead, but upon his untimely death, she refused to return still. Mother doesn't care about the incident at all really, shrugging it off and saying that a little bit of money turned it into no problem whatsoever, completely forgotten. It's just one of those moments that you look back on in the past with the eyes of the future to laugh about a little bit. She cared much more for Hana than she did for what one slanderous customer might say to a few other people, which itself might be quite minimal considering that he was very drunk, so might not even remember it, and who knows how much he'll want to talk about going to a bar that does drag shows in a world where conservative business reputation is, well, pretty much everything. It wasn't a pretty scene for sure, but it really wasn't that big of a deal. So why would Hana leave the only place which accepted her over something that's really quite minimal? Well, she cares for others to a detriment. We can start to see how this mindset develops by considering her past in relation to this. We spoke about her being in dire need of support due to her limiting factors, that there really was no way for her to just tough it out and build a life. And this is what she received at Angel Tower, a place which was willing to offer that, which she of course repaid in some way by performing and likely just helping out around in general. But being thrown away as a child is, of course, going to leave some marks on a person. And for her, as well as with the specific pains of identity, this developed a need to appear perfect, to be accepted and welcomed, to not be discarded again. When you're tossed away so easily, before you could even be aware of doing something wrong, it sets this precedent that you can always be thrown away for any small thing that you might not even know what it is, and so you just have to be perfect. You have to provide no reason to be thrown away. It's also something we can intuit, or more like extrapolate, from the transgender experience. When you're attempting to get people to understand that your gender is different from their preconception, you need to have a lot of convincing power, because people really don't want to rethink their preconceptions. You have to try and sit properly, speak properly, eat properly, do everything that they associate with what you are, so they finally start to accept it. It's a pressure to be perfect to the standards of what you're trying to be, at least around not so accepting people, because you don't have the default preconceptions to rely on. You aren't able to do one or two things out of the box as someone whose gender matches their sex, because those are overlooked when it matches, but overlooked in the sense of being overly looked at when it doesn't match. We can see some sort of this early on as she tries to coach Miyuki in how to be more proper about how she eats, trying to guide her to be more gentle and feminine. But what this all means for the present moment, at least the moment we're talking about being present, even though it's a thing in the past, the incident at Angel Tower, what this all means about that is that she could no longer appear perfect post that incident. She probably believed abandonment would come soon because of it, and so, feeling very worthless, how could they not discard her now that they've seen what she's really like, that she could be a hindrance? But it goes deeper than this as well, as it also technically places a cost on her being there or having been there. They had to pay off the customer a direct monetary loss, and if she stays now, this place that cares for people like her has the reputation of protecting people who attack customers. We said it was a minimal risk, but it's still a risk that she's obviously considering. Her staying might only hurt the people who were kind to her, right? When someone feels that their life has proven its worthlessness over and over again, any small cost can appear to be worth more than their own life. What does it matter if leaving ruins her life because it's just not worth as much as the others, right? She doesn't feel she has a right to return because she was an inconvenience, a cost, a burden. Always needing support, it's hard to not feel like your presence can only drag down the people you care about. And so, at least in that mentality, to really care for them, the best thing you can do is leave them, you might think. And if possible, make them look better when you do it. We see this happen later in the film as Gin is reunited with his daughter, but isn't quite honest with her about the current state of his life, saying that he's just in recycling, not his actual situation. Both being angered by his deception and also knowing that honesty is the only way he'll repair this relationship, Hana has an outburst once again, yelling about how awful he is and stating much more plainly that he is currently living on the streets, turning to outright insults against someone she's admitted to loving. She storms off with Miyuki, leaving Gin to presumably be somewhat comforted by his daughter. Yes, what Hana said was true, but in such a harsh way that it actually makes Gin look somewhat sympathetic in comparison. After all, he was helping to support someone who now looks so awful. As Hana and Miyuki leave, she explains this through a story about two devils. The short of it is, the red one wants to be friends with the humans, but the humans don't like devils, and so the blue one fake attacks them so the red one can save them and be their hero, but that's at the cost of their original friend, the blue devil, being an outcast they can never see again. The blue devil sacrifices their own happiness for the reds. Of course, this is exactly what Hana is doing. It's not very subtle or hard to understand. We all make others look better or ourselves worse depending on the situations. But the more interesting note is, of course, understanding why she could see this as an action worth doing. Would you live as an outcast forever just to make one person a bit more happy? Now, what about if you saw your own life as worthless and already guaranteed to become an outcast? Then wouldn't this actually be the worthwhile thing, at least getting some positiveness out of your outcastness instead of just letting it befall you with nothing good coming of it? It's easy for her to believe her life could never be improved, but it can be used to ensure that the lives of the people she cares about are. If throwing away any care for herself brings more care to someone else, it's the logical decision. It's an option probably all too common to people who have to find their own identities. Lost in the confusion of that, undefined and feeling worthless, what reason is there to not throw yourself away for another? And it comes to its most literal point at the climax where she leaps from a building to catch and save Kiyoko, literally throwing herself towards death for another. Luckily, well, that's really all you can say to describe the physicality of this moment is luckily, it works out. But we can't always expect luck to care for us more than we do. What we see in Hana is caring for others to a detriment, giving so much of oneself due to a worthlessness felt from day one and never escaping because you provided so much for others you're never able to provide for yourself in this cycle. We see that without some degree of selfishness, we lose ourselves to kindness. But just the same, and I know this is no shocker, caring too much for oneself and not for others can be just as dangerous. But the twist is that it isn't just a danger to others, or that it becomes a danger to us because we lose others from doing it, but that we can actively make decisions we know harm us from thinking too much about ourselves. We'll move on to Gin, the father of this ragtag family the movie centers around. Before this, he lived a perfectly normal life as far as we could tell. He and his wife owned a bicycle shop, which they operated together and got by enough to raise a child on. It seems entirely unremarkable in the best ways. But in the background, trouble was brewing as Gin was losing himself to his addictions, alcohol and gambling, and then lying to his family about the debts from both of these. This continued to grow worse and worse, with each gamble feeling like the one that could save his life, only to damn him just that little bit more. As these became untenable, he left his family to live where he couldn't be found, never making them aware of his fate. They'd go on search for years, even checking unidentified corpses, hoping to find any sign of their husband and father. He feels worthless from the entire ordeal, of course, believing himself to be nothing more than trash to be thrown away. We see this the most after Miyuki and Kiyoko are kidnapped, leading to Hana trying to chase them down and him instead just saying, and refusing to go after them. He sees the situation as much too tough for them to solve and sits down to drink instead. Hana calls him the trash, runs off to save them, and his mindset and drunken state lead to this exchange in the back of those words. It's a tragic tale, a man internally tortured by how much he destroyed his family, and now, once again, how little he's trying to save his found family. But there is a selfish truth at the heart of it. Where Hana didn't have much choice about where her life ended up, with a love who died by chance and a childhood full of abandonment, Gin was living an average life with a happy family, but couldn't control himself enough to save it. In an odd way, the decision to live as he does now is an act of protection. He leaves behind the shameful mess that he made in the care of his family's hands and flees to where the story can be whatever he wishes it to be. The tale he tells Hana is much more sympathetic, saying that he was a professional cyclist who took a dive for money to pay for his daughter's necessary surgery, but he was caught, lost everything, his daughter died without the medical care she needed, and his wife followed soon after. He says it as a man broken by life, that after being beaten down by so long and so unfairly, he just couldn't bring himself to work any longer. The story he tells has a large impact on how he's viewed. It's very close to the start of the film, and it contextualizes his actions in a much different light than what they truly are. When he's reluctant to care for Kiyoko, but then does so well, it seems to be because he's a man harmed by the world, wanting to protect himself from caring once again because the world was what hurt him before through sheer happenstance and bad luck. But of course, we learn the truth, especially when we see him refuse to chase after the kidnapped Kiyoko and Miyuki, that at the end of the day, when things get tough, he simply prioritizes himself over the rest. Now, some unknown, very minor background characters say that they won't even want to be near Miyuki because Gin will think they were messing with her and hurt them if they do, showing that of course he cares to some degree, but when push really comes to shove, he's always his own top priority. He'll fight for her, but not if it gets to the degree we see in the kidnapping. And so, escaping to a much worse life is a sort of protection. It's evading a shame he found more painful than this lack of stability and leaving his debts to someone else. His mistakes are paid off by the wife and child that he left behind. But it's also protection in the sense of growth. Not growing a bank account to combat the debt, but growing and changing as a person to be better. To properly handle the situation at home, he would have to totally clean up his act, saving instead of gambling, no more getting drunk, both to make good decisions and to save up everything he can. It wouldn't be comfortable, and the struggle with addiction is a very tough battle that shouldn't be looked down upon. It's a long and hard path which is defined by dedication and self-control for the rest of one's life, where failure is always looming, and the thing that causes you failure is normalized. That's not an easy state for anyone to be in for the rest of their life. But at the end of the day, it is their actions they have to handle through dedication, and this is what he seeks to escape. I'm by no means saying that the life he lives now is comfortable or easy, but it does avoid the changes he needed to make. He doesn't need to dedicate himself to making proper decisions to maintain a family. He can get drunk whenever and wherever he wishes with no restraint more than how much money he has to buy alcohol or how much he can find. He doesn't have to learn to control his gambling because now he simply doesn't have the opportunity or resources to even think about gambling. Rather than becoming a better person, he takes on a harsher life where he doesn't have the same reasons to be a better person. He can be however awful he wants to no effect, lying just to make it all sound more sympathetic. In an odd way, choosing this very harsh life was the more comfortable option for him. It presented a daily struggle that should never be understated, but it solved a personal and internal struggle, avoiding his mistakes and his shame. What he's doing is accepting a worthlessness to his life as an excuse. When he said they shouldn't chase down Miyuki and Kiyoko because, well, they're not action heroes, it's saying that I'm not good enough to even bother trying as an excuse against anything and everything. If he believes himself to be trash worth discarding and nothing more, then what reason is there to ever better his life? That's what he is. That's what he is. There's no reason to change things. And again, we can only say this because this was a choice he made, not a situation he was forced into, even if addiction is a very present force. What really shows this is that when he reconnects with his daughter by chance and they speak about the man who he owed money to being shot and surviving, Gin is actually relieved that the man didn't die, saying that I ran up the debts, not him, acknowledging that he made mistakes. This means that he isn't just saying he made no mistakes, but that he's using those mistakes to reason he can never be better. It's actually defining himself by those mistakes, by those worst moments, and nothing else. He has been saving money the whole time to one day hopefully give to his family, though, a sum of some 30,000 yen, about $275 at that time. A drop in the bucket, but still showing he understands to some degree he has a responsibility to be better and is capable of doing so. That's what makes it so tough, is it's there, it's deep in him, but it can't come out, it can't be expressed in full. And this money really shows that dedication, as when a gang of delinquents beat him viciously in what they call New Year's cleanup and take this money from him, he chases them down to his own detriment, getting even more abused to retrieve this sum he held onto. And that's how he ends up at Angel Tower. It's not impossible for him to dedicate himself to something, clearly we see. But the thing is, he could have done more. He could have done more just by staying, by doing nothing. What he did instead was accept his mistakes to a fault, so harshly taking them on that he never believed there was a chance to be better, and that the greatest option was simply to remove himself, to exist as the horrible person he thinks himself to be, and nothing more. In short, he never makes himself more than his mistakes. And yes, in a way that is still caring for himself above others. We can still care for things we don't find valuable, Part of caring for others is moving past our mistakes to do better by them. They weren't in a vacuum. It wasn't a career mistake some bachelor made. It was a family man who ruined the stability of the whole unit. In that situation, there is a responsibility to move forward, to deal with the situation, and then worry about what one is or isn't in terms of value. He chose to have a family, and he chose to gamble in a way. All of what follows is a mostly selfish path, caring for himself above others, and to his own great detriment. And lastly, we have Miyuki. She came from a situation more akin to Gin's than Hana's, the daughter of a police investigative father and a presumably stay-at-home mother, living the ordinary life. She was mostly left to her own devices, often ignored by her father, and her mother seems to have been too wrapped up in religious traditions to have much direct input either. We don't see this directly ourselves, but in her responses to certain small events in the movie. As she browses through a parenting book full of pictures of happy fathers holding their children, she simply says, "bullshit," because she never experienced something like that and believes its occurrence is just a lie, a fancy presentation for this book because fathers don't actually care like that. And when Hana and Gin are caring for Kiyoko, she pretends to be asleep but keeps an eye out here and there to see what exactly they're doing. It's a curiosity rooted in novelty. She doesn't know what a father taking care of a child feels like, and so she wants to see. She takes time reading that parenting book for the same reason. This is the feeling that was building up when she was still at home, a very soft neglect, with the only source of real comfort she found in her cat Angel, named for the wing-like spots on its back. But when it disappears, she thought her father had gotten rid of it, maybe even killed it, and lost herself for just long enough to stab him in response. She throws him her homemade scarf that he never wore, saying he should use that to mop up the blood, and that's the last we see of her family interactions. She does brag that unlike the other two, she can go home whenever she wants, but she never will because of that fear of her father. A man who never took time away from work to care for her before, why would he welcome her back now? If anything, he'd have her arrested, and she says so many times herself. This lack of tenderness in her life leads to an interesting state where, since she was never cared for, she can't really recognize what being cared for actually looks like. She might not even think it really exists. She only thinks that she'll be greeted with anger and hostility because to her, everything looks like anger and hostility, or at the best, being ignored. We see this as the trio board a train trying to track down Kiyoko's mother, and it stops opposite another one as the tracks are covered with snow, which just so happens to place her and her father eye to eye across the tracks. He begins to shout, trying to get her attention, and picks up his phone, still trying to shout and get her attention, and she hides out of view just beside the window. Overwhelmed and feeling that she's about to be tracked down and arrested, probably thinking he's calling the police right then, she climbs out of the window, with Hana and Gin following in suit, having wasted the train fare. It seems only logical. He's a cop who didn't really care about her, so he should be only mad about what happened, right? He was definitely calling the police. The only outcome could be arrest. But when we look closer, there's an important detail. He is wearing the scarf that she threw at him that day when their eyes met on the train. And that snap decision of judging the situation only on what we knew before, it looks a lot like anger. But with a full assessment, we see he was trying to find her through kindness, having now understood his mistakes and wanting to make right by his daughter, even despite her assault. He's remembering her every day with that scarf. Forgiving a large mistake so readily, is there much more that's indicative of care? The issue is that because he never did before, she can't recognize it as such now. One large action of kindness doesn't necessarily equate to many smaller ones. We see more definitive proof that he cares later on, though, as of course screaming and pounding will look a lot like anger. When they find the former, now burnt down home of Kiyoko's parents, there are some newspapers sitting around, and just happening to glance at one, Miyuki sees this. Their father didn't get rid of the cat or kill it, it just ran away for a moment. And even if he did get rid of it, he welcomed it back. Now, when it found its way home, he'll of course put up with a pet for her. In the hopes of trying anything to find her, he took out a newspaper ad with this message, and in a movie all about these kinds of coincidences, it works. With this in mind, she takes the chance to make a payphone call and reaches him at home. But a bit too scared to say anything, she simply hesitates, and her father's first reaction is to ask if it's her and if she's okay. But clearly, in a state of fear, she's unable to respond and hangs up, crying in the booth as she does. Of course, she'd want to go home. She even starts to see that it might be possible enough to make a call. But that fear of what will happen when she does is holding her back. We see 2 times where her father is now trying to care for her, one which could have looked like anger but wasn't, and one which seems pretty plainly like a loving worry. But the problem is, when someone has never seen the complexities of care before, they're not going to understand them when they matter. They're not going to have an eye for the fine details that show what might look like anger could actually just be panic driven by love based on the situation. They might not be able to understand that someone could actually change to want to now show them a kindness they didn't know before. They might not even think that real love exists. But the 2 adult stories were about caring for oneself or others too much. Miyuki's is about being cared for, or more specifically, the complexities that arise later when someone isn't cared for even if they're provided for, and just how hard it can be to right the ship if it's never properly steered for so many years. And this also makes it hard to accept love when it's finally offered to them. It's no secret that Hana, Gin, and Miyuki are essentially a family of their own, playing out their respective roles in the ways they know. But Miyuki is the one who recognizes that fact the most minimally, at least externally so. The former 2 try their best to provide for her, with Hana wanting to give her a set of world literature books that she found for Christmas to ensure that Miyuki is still being educated somewhat, still being raised properly. And when she scoffs it off, Gin tells her that she should respect and accept the gift from someone who worked to find it for her, while behind the scenes wanting to protect her himself, carrying in his own ways. But she gets argumentative instead, believing that she doesn't need to accept their help, despite only surviving in this situation exactly because of their help. She's only a sheltered 14-year-old. She desperately needs assistance right now, and rightfully so at that age. Unprepared for life, it takes that. But she can't understand it or respond well to it. She believes she doesn't need it because she doesn't know that it really exists. When Hana tries to impart anything she finds important onto Miyuki, she turns to insults and rebellion instead because care is just an act, right? She doesn't want that fakeness in her life. This continues to change as the movie progresses, as her flashback about stabbing her father transforms into a family setting where those 2 are her parents instead, and Kiyoko takes the place of Angel. She doesn't understand this immediately, saying, "Why are you here?" to them both. But of course, for us, the point is quite clear. She's starting to see what a family is really built on, that even in the dire circumstances they're experiencing right now, something intangible pulls them together. She's beginning to understand this care she's shown simply by being forcefully exposed to it now again and again from these 2. Hana ran all over a dangerous section of the city screaming for her, exerting herself to make sure the person she loves is okay. She lets down all of her own insecurities and guards, overcoming her own issues for a moment for someone else. After Hana finds her and expresses that she's glad Miyuki is okay, the younger doesn't grow argumentative anymore, but instead looks away, flustered. She doesn't know how to express what this feeling means, but she also doesn't want to push back against it anymore. It's basically that she can't deny it after the day they've had. It exists, and it's meaningful. She's slowly undoing all those years prior which conditioned her otherwise. And this slow evolution is what we see in the climax. Now, the trio succeeds in returning Kiyoko to her mother, except it's not really the mother. Gin, on his own part of the adventure after Hana storms off with Miyuki post-daughter reunion, finds the father instead of the mother, a gambling addict who drove up their debts, leading her to work a terrible job to make up for it, who tells him that she stole the baby from the ward, it isn't actually theirs. He gets this information to Hana and Miyuki only after they return Kiyoko, so they chase down the mother, whose deteriorated mental state leads her to take them on an even crazier chase, risking everyone's lives in the process, even to eventually crashing into a large building. Miyuki is the one who's able to chase her up to the roof the fastest, and so she ends up as the one trying to talk Sachiko off the ledge. And the tack she chooses is Well, not very tactful at all. Rather than forgiveness or understanding, she says, it's a very odd thing. It's of course rooted in the idea that life is valuable because she shouldn't take another that's just starting with her if she makes that decision, but it's said in a very harsh and real way. It's something said by someone who's only now feeling care in harsh circumstances that they would find realistic and true to say. There's a lot of softness throughout it, of course, saying that a life is only born once and caring deeply for Kiyoko's safety, but not yet caring for Sachiko's safety in the same way, not yet caring for all humans in the same way. But it's a mixture that shows more of this evolution. Like Hana did for her, now she's the one exerting herself to save a child she wants to see be okay. She knows it enough to know what's really important about it, even if she can't put it to the best words or express it to everyone. The slow evolution of her feelings is key because it stresses that danger one last time. That we have to not just care for people or provide for them, but make it clear and obvious and warm. We have to make sure they know they're cared for so they can care for others. What we see across all three is that they felt there was some mistake which was grand enough they had to or even wanted to leave behind their families, whether they be found, formed, or born into. They each felt that something outweighed their value to those other people, and overall, even to the world. But each one is welcomed back with open arms, without even a hint of scorn across all cases, from gambling debt to stabbings. Gin's arc ends as his daughter welcomes him back without even an ounce of ill will, offering him her address and number to stay in touch. She says she always wanted to find him again, despite being left behind with all that debt. The harshest mistakes paled in comparison for the human desire to care for the people we feel are important. He was running away all this time on the basis that he was too worthless and his mistakes too great to ever try for something more. But in this one instant, with nothing more than a gentle tone, his daughter was able to prove both of those things false. It will take work to mend his life, but there is a reward for doing it. He has the potential to do so, and people want him to do so. Nothing can ever make someone garbage worth discarding like he thought he was. With this recognition, there's nowhere left for him to hide. What solved his story is what he failed to show in tough times, shown to him in tough times. Not grand gestures or fixing everything in an instant, but just staying. Just simple care. We saw the same thing with Hana, who returns in desperation to find that even across years of the unknown, there was always a place willing to welcome her, no matter what she looked like or who she was with. She felt that after her slip-up, it was only natural to be discarded, but they can prove to her that there is no such thing. Not losing her cool, not disappearing, there is nothing that suddenly makes her not worth caring about. Much like Gin's story, her happy, trending, yet open-ended arc is solved with that simple expression that the lives we find important are worth so much more than the mistakes they may have made. And Miyuki's ending only occurs in the final moments, as the actual parents of Kiyoko want to meet the people who saved their daughter, not even hesitating when they're told that the people who did it didn't have a home. And who's handling the case? Of course, Miyuki's father. As they find each other again, this time with no escape, and with Miyuki learning more about what's possible, the story ends. We can only imagine what comes next, but I think it's quite clear it's something positive. Their found family might be in turmoil now, but only because they learned that they were never truly discarded. There was never a time where they truly had nowhere to go. They all found each other, and that was good, but they were never each other's last resorts. Someone, somewhere, no matter what, was always caring for them. This is a vein running through every action of the film. We see unhoused parents caring for a child that isn't even theirs off the care of other parents who never got to give care when they rob gravesite offerings. There's a rich man who hates his scumbag soon-to-be son-in-law, saved from an assassin by him nonetheless, and the man who was that assassin doing so to provide for his family at home, who then care for the hostages he took in order to make it back to them alive. The entire series of events is an odd mishmash of family, from biological to found, rich to poor, across places and times, identities, and nationalities. And the care that these people express, the common thread, breaks past barriers, like the excitement of two people who don't speak the same language, being able to communicate one thing still, about the people they love. No matter what, almost every single person ever born can understand this expression in very different ways, but with the same basis. It's something stronger than borders and barriers, and so of course stronger than mistakes. It's stronger than the biology which formed the first ones even. We, as human beings, have both the stressful responsibility and the grand freedom to choose and care for our own loved ones. We have the ability to decide that there are people to us who can always be valuable no matter what mistakes they introduce to their and our lives. And as long as we have that ability, it means that within reason, there is no one beyond love, that there is no life worth throwing into the trash. If these three can come together, if a father-in-law who hates his son can be saved by him, if a mother who doesn't even speak the language of a woman her husband kidnapped who's taking care of a child someone else kidnapped and threw in the trash can still care about each other, then there is always someone who can care for who we are. We can't guarantee when or where it will come, but in all spaces and across all times, it is possible and it exists. And that is something worth continuing for. And that's obviously where I'd like for this video to end. But it's one of those topics that I really, even though it's just part of a story, I really don't feel comfortable making money on because I don't know, it's a real serious thing affecting people, not just when this was made even, but now and continuously. Um, and it feels weird for me to profit from that, even if it's from someone else's story, even if these aren't characters who are real, that they're mimicking real people's lives that are happening right now. And so what I've done is I've taken what I think this video, not what I think this video will make, what this video would make if it gets somewhere around 15 or 30,000 views, and donated that to a local organization in my area called the Jubilee Kitchen, which is a soup kitchen that also offers some different things, as well as not just serving meals there, but providing food for households, facilities for cleanliness, clothing, different things like that. It says financial assistance and a few things as well. I'm not extremely versed on it, but I've checked it all over. It seems reputable, good enough. The reviews and ratings seem okay, so I felt comfortable giving the money there of what I think this video will make. And the reason why I do that is because if a video isn't monetized, YouTube isn't making anything from it. They're not going to push the video. And so for people to be able to see this, which helps me do well, but also then means that what is made from it is able to go somewhere from that greater reach. I always make the decision to keep these videos monetized, but to push that money somewhere else, not to me, but somewhere where it's actually going to do good and be a lot more respectful to the subject matter. I think that's everything I really had to say on it. If you have the ability to, especially at this time of the year, I definitely encourage you to do whatever you can. Whether that's monetarily or volunteering or anything. And that's somewhat hypocritical for me to say because I myself am not volunteering. Even if my time's limited, it's a shortcoming of mine that I'm not out there having more of a direct impact. And I'll acknowledge that too. But it's an important time, especially in places where I am, where it's colder and conditions are getting a lot more harsh and things. That a lot can really help all the time, but especially right now. But yeah, so I'm sorry the video couldn't end on the kind of more dramatic, cinematic note for covering such a good movie, and a movie that, for using such harsh language, is still so much more respectful and real to specific subject matter and real issues affecting people than many more others. Another one of the great works by Satoshi Kon. But that's an unnecessary ramble at the end. So sorry to take up more of your time with this, but it's something that, again, this isn't an issue I've experienced myself. It's not something that I know firsthand, and so I if I make money off of that, that's a dark path to start going down. So I just wanted to make this very clear at the end. But anyway, yeah, that's my ramble of it at the end out of the way. Sorry, there's no visuals for this, but my whole setup is torn down right now. But yeah, anyway, thank you for watching, especially if you listen to this ramble at the end. Yeah, and I hope you have a good holiday seasony thingy here. Anyway, thank you. Have a good one.